So the EPA has a new set of proposed rules and regulations on the water that the federal government somehow should control. Now, the Clean Water Act, passed in like 1972, said that the federal government had the right to have input on navigable waters. And the constitutional hook for that is navigable means what? It means that you can put something on that can transport something that can be sold. So interstate commerce, which is the Constitution says the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. There was probably no disagreement now, or shouldn't be then, as to what navigable meant. But the EPA has decided in this new proposed rule, well, navigable waters means any water that could ever flow into a stream, that could flow into another stream, that could flow into another stream, that you can navigate. So what's that? That means all water. And there's lots of concern about that. Whether you're a builder trying to develop a subdivision, or you're a farmer who suddenly wonders, now what kind of new permits am I going to have to get from the federal government every time I want to do something, or a city. You know, every ditch in America, theoretically, is a navigable water. If you believe this view of the law, the water runoffs out by Porter Wagner Boulevard would all be navigable waters. Now, there may be a moment of downpour where occasionally it looks like they could be navigable, but we all know that's not. And so just, you know, we've got to get the regulators under control. So that's probably it's already passed the House. It forces this president and any future president to have to think twice before they get outside the law, because like you could take this rule by the EPA, and I'm pretty sure the House of Representatives would look at that and vote. A majority would say, no, we don't think that the law gives the EPA any ability to do that. And once they have that vote, then any member of the House would be authorized to go to court and say, okay, you decide right now. Let's not wait for 2 or 3 years for the Supreme Court to finally decide that's what this means, after all kinds of money's been spent, after all kinds of jobs have not been created, after all kinds of things have happened. Let's not do that then, let's do it right now, as quick as we can. Now, if I want to do anything now with the court as your senator, the most I could do is wait for somebody who says, no, this rule hurt me, so I'm going to go to court. And then I could organize a friend of the court brief that say, okay, here, Roy Blunt and 35 other senators, or maybe 95 other senators, wouldn't matter. We all agree that the law is not being. We could file that brief, but that's only after somebody else has had to take the initiative. And so the last Supreme Court session that just ended, there were a handful of major cases that the Supreme Court decided, no, the President doesn't have the authority to do this. There was one on religious freedom, there was one with the EPA, there was one on some appointments to the National Labor Relations Board, where all of their rules were thrown out because they said, well, the President decided that the Senate wasn't in session when the Senate said it was in session, so he could then make what's called recess appointments. Turned out all those appointments were illegal, everything those appointees did were illegal. But all the money that people had to spend to try to comply with those rules until they knew they were illegal was gone. So, you know, we just need to get the regulators under control. I think I should have to vote on every regulation that has any economic impact. And I've always thought that. I've introduced legislation every year I've been in the Congress, so we should have to vote on these things. And other legislation says, and by the way, after rules have been out there some period of time, 5 or 6 or 10 years, they should all go away. That every agency should have to come back and re-justify that this rule is still needed, and here's why we still need it. But now, why would I think I should have to vote? Because you need to be able to get your hands on somebody who is responsible for this. And a lot of these things just wouldn't happen. In 2009, the House passed something called cap and trade, which was to put less carbon in the air, to an extreme point that in our state it would have doubled. Our utility bills would have gone up by 80% in 10 years. Well, I voted against it. I was a House member at the time. I was adamantly opposed to it, but most people hadn't thought about it much yet. Maybe members of Congress had. Most people, but once people started thinking, they said, well, wait a minute, you mean this would almost double my utility bill in 10 years? Now, once people figured that out, the Senate was never going to pass cap and trade. But the president said at the time, well, more than one way to skin a cat, that's a quote from the president on this issue. And so now the EPA regulators are trying to do what the normal process of government would never do, because it doesn't make economic sense, nor does it make environmental sense. Because if you double our utility bill, the jobs we lose, and we would lose jobs if you double our utility bill, would not go to somewhere else in the United States that already has twice the utility bill we have. It's one of our advantages is we do have pretty low utilities in the middle of the country. It doesn't seem like that in the middle of winter when you're paying your bill, but it's one of our advantages. They wouldn't go somewhere. They go to India or China or Brazil or Mexico or somewhere that cares a whole lot less about what comes out of the utility smokestack than we do. So instead of a win-win, it's a lose-lose. We lose the jobs we otherwise would have gotten, and some we currently have. And the problem you're trying to solve gets worse, not better, because you've driven those jobs to places that care less than we do about this issue. So, there are a number of things we need to do here, and we've got great opportunities. We just need to be sure that we're not regulated. Let me tell you one more story on the water issue. So, a lot of concern about this EPA rule on water. So Gina McCarthy, who's the head of the EPA, was going to come to Missouri about a month ago and talk about this, and she starts by saying she's going to come because there are all kinds of myths, and people's concerns are ludicrous, and she's going to straighten all that out while she's here. And then the spokesman for the Missouri Farm Bureau said, well, farmers are very concerned that all of their normal practices could be impacted by another level of regulators. And she says, her response to that, this is a very reputable group that's represented Missouri agriculture for a long time. She said, well, that's just hogwash. So that's her public comment about what the Missouri Farm Bureau says. That's hogwash. So when you've got regulators whose view of people's opinion about a regulation is it's hogwash, you've got the world is turned upside down, where suddenly the regulators think that we work for them rather than that they work for us. And that, it is a good example of how out of touch the regulators are and how these things don't make sense. So hopefully things like the Enforce Act, things like a sunset on regulations, things like me having to vote on every regulation that has economic impact are the kinds of things that Congress will begin to deal with. Because when you talk to anybody who makes economic decisions, they say regulation is their biggest enemy right now, that excessive regulation. And who's hurt most by that? Poor people and young people. Poor people and young people. People who are going to have the hardest time paying the double utility bill. People that can barely pay their utility bill now. If you make less than if you're a family, you make less than $30,000, 20% of your income already goes to your utility bill. What if it's 40%? What if it's 25%? And what about young people? If you don't have good job opportunities, people don't get that first critical job, and they don't eventually get the job with the good take-home pay that families need. So we just got to be sure we don't do that. And I think there is this this agenda that works against excessive regulation is one of the very most important things that this Congress has failed to do and the next Congress needs to do. But I'd love to see us get a chance to vote on the Enforce the Law Act. It might pass. I don't know if the President would sign it. I think it probably passed the Senate, but the current Senate majority leader is not going to let us have that vote this year, so maybe it'll be one of the early votes somebody lets us have next year. So thank you. I'll be glad to any advice or a couple of questions before we have to go.